It was the last December of her life, the year 1938, when the small house in Hollywood grew strangely still. Neighbors whispered of the faint hiss that seeped beneath the door, the heavy sweetness of coal gas that lingered in the winter air. Inside, Florence Lawrence lay alone, Hollywood's very first movie star, her passing unnoticed by the world she had once enchanted. Once her face had filled theaters with awe, her name igniting wonder wherever it appeared. But at the end there was only silence and the faint memory of applause that had long since faded. Welcome, friends of memory, from every place and every hour. Tell me in the comments below when and where you are listening, so that your voice may join this tapestry of shared recollection. Do not forget to subscribe to keep our circle alive, and together we will walk gently into the shadows of history. The gas flame flickered low in the kitchen of her home, its small tongue of blue light wavering as if uncertain whether to burn or vanish. That wavering flame was the final witness of Florence Lawrence's life, and in its quivering glow we may glimpse the end before we return to the beginning. For every story, like every breath, circles back upon itself. It is perhaps fitting, though unbearably cruel, that the woman who was the first star of cinema, the first face known by name to countless millions, should have her life close in near obscurity, her body found only after neighbors grew uneasy at the silence. One might wonder if she heard, in that final hour, the echoes of her own applause rising faintly in memory, like surf far away. Or did the sound of laughter and gasps, the thrill of eyes that once adored her, dissolve into the stillness of a Los Angeles afternoon? We cannot know. Yet when we lean close to the story of her life, it seems the shadows of this ending were always present, veiled within her rise, even when she was most luminous. Her final act was not one of performance, but of surrender, and in that surrender the circle closed upon her. For Florence had lived, always, at the crossing point of invention and erasure, where newness shines brightly and is then discarded once the next marvel arrives. To tell her life is to tell not only of a woman, but of the birth of celebrity itself, and the perilous fragility of being the first in an age that never looked back. She was born before the very idea of a movie star existed, and she died when it had become a ravenous system, swallowing its pioneers whole. Yet before the silence there was a child, a girl named Florence Annie Bridgewood, born in Hamilton, Ontario, in the year 1886. She was the daughter of a vaudeville performer, Charlotte Bridgewood, whose feet had known the restlessness of the traveling stage, whose voice had filled halls not yet wired for microphones, whose laughter had carried in smoke-filled rooms. Her father, less present in her story, fades from the frame, while her mother's spirit seems to guide her first steps. In the life of Florence, performance was never chosen, but inherited. Like a breath one does not realize one is holding until it escapes. Imagine the scent of dust on curtains, the crack of boards underfoot, the warm sting of grease paint. This was her cradle, her nursery, her school. And when she gazed out at the lights, what did she feel? Wonder? Fear? Or that sense, rare and perilous, that the world beyond the curtain might someday belong to her? The young Florence did not know the immensity of the path before her. She could not know that she would become the Biograph Girl, the face that turned nameless, flickering shadows into stars. She could not know that the modern cult of celebrity would, in many ways, trace its roots back to her smile, her gestures, her very presence. She knew only the rhythm of the stage, the discipline of performance, the music of her mother's world. Perhaps this is why her rise seemed almost inevitable to those who later recalled her, though inevitability is always an illusion we cast backward, as if the road had been destined when, in truth, it was stumbled upon step by step. We might pause to ask, what is it in a face that compels the multitude? Why does one countenance, out of countless thousands, bear the burden of meaning for an age? The camera of those early years was unrefined, the films brief, the plot simple. Yet audiences saw in Florence something luminous, some spark that seemed to leap across the divide between flickering screen and living eye. It was not merely beauty, though beauty she had. It was not solely grace, though her movements carried ease. It was something stranger, harder to grasp, a quality that suggested both intimacy and distance at once. She seemed to belong to the viewer, yet she remained untouchable. This is the paradox of stardom, and Florence was its first incarnation. But such reflections belong to later years. For now, in this first telling, we remain with the child, the girl who ran among props and painted backdrops, who watched her mother balance performance with survival. We may imagine her peering into the glow of an oil lamp as shadows played upon the wall, already captivated by the magic of moving images, though she could not know that soon they would grow larger than any stage. The late 19th century was still an age of transition, when steam and horse still shared the streets, when electric light was a novelty, when the moving picture was an experiment. In this world, Florence was but a seed, fragile and unassuming, destined to rise yet also destined to fall, as all pioneers must. And so, when we consider her death, the gas flame, the silence, the forgottenness, it is not only tragedy we feel. There is also the solemn recognition that her life was never meant to endure in the way she once seemed to promise. She was the first light in a world learning how to gaze, and the first light is always consumed by the darkness it helps illuminate. In her fall, the very machinery of fame was revealed, its indifference, its hunger, its ruthless speed. Her ending, lonely as it was, speaks still, for it asks us whether memory itself is any kinder than fame. And do we remember Florence Lawrence because she was loved or because she was lost? Do we recall her as a pioneer or as a warning? The flicker of the gas flame fades now, its light trembling one last time before giving way to shadow. The silence deepens, and we lean forward, searching for a sound within it. Was that the hush of a curtain rising, or the applause of a distant hall? The answer lies not in the silence, but in what follows. For every ending is also a beginning. The flickering gas flame dims into a softer glow, and as we lean closer, it becomes a candlelight trembling in a small room in Hamilton, Ontario. The year is 1886, and winter presses against the walls with a hush of snow. A child has just entered the world, Florence Annie Bridgewood, born not into wealth or ease, but into the restless life of performance and traveling shows. The flame of that candle seems fragile, and yet within it there stirs a future no one in the house could have imagined, a life that would become the first glimmer of Hollywood's vast constellation. Her mother, Charlotte Bridgewood, was no stranger to the stage. She had once commanded audiences with her voice, a vaudeville actress who understood the strange alchemy of applause, the way it lifts and wounds, fills and empties in the same breath. To Charlotte, the world of performance was both sustenance and chain, and it was this world she passed to her daughter, not as a gift, but as the only inheritance she possessed. Florence's father, less constant, fades from her story almost as soon as it begins. The absence of his figure left the child more firmly bound to her mother's presence and to the rhythms of performance life. In those early years, Florence would have known the scent of grease paint, the coarse fabric of costumes folded and unfolded, the sharp crack of boards under hurried feet. A traveling troupe was like a small society unto itself, constantly assembling and dispersing, never still. The child learned to read faces quickly, to move with rhythm, to sit quietly in the shadows while others rehearsed. Performance seeped into her, not as a choice, but as an atmosphere, like the air itself. Hamilton at the close of the 19th century was a place caught between old and new. Horse-drawn wagons still clattered through its streets, but steam and smoke already marked the horizon. Electric light, still novel, glowed faintly in shop windows, and photographs began to fix images in ways no memory could. For Florence, the city was both home and threshold, a place from which her journey would begin. Did she look at its narrow streets and feel them too small, too confined for the restless flicker within her? Or did she, even then, long for the steadiness that performance denied her? The candlelight trembles again, and we see her as a girl, her dark eyes searching. Her mother's life taught her that survival depended not only on skill, but on presence, on the ability to captivate. Perhaps Charlotte whispered to her daughter that beauty fades unless it is sharpened by will, that audiences love quickly, but forget more quickly still. Such lessons, learned in childhood, would become the silent script of Florence's life. They were lessons written not in ink, but in the air she breathed, invisible yet enduring. And so, Florence stepped onto stages before she had fully grown, her gestures precise, her smile lighting dim halls. She was not yet famous, not yet even a name, but already she carried that intangible quality that made strangers lean forward. It is difficult to describe, for it was not merely prettiness or skill, though she had both. It was the way she seemed to blur the line between herself and the story she performed, as if she were not playing a role but becoming it. This quality would later mesmerize film audiences, who knew nothing of her yet felt they had always known her. We must pause and wonder, does such a gift bring freedom, or does it bind more tightly? When a child carries this radiance, does it open paths, or does it set her upon a road from which she cannot depart? Florence, in her youth, could not have foreseen the machinery of Hollywood that would one day grind around her. She knew only the thrill of applause, the warmth of eyes upon her, the joy of being seen. She could not yet feel the weight of being seen too much, nor the hollowness of being unseen when the lights turn away. In those days before the 20th century dawned, entertainment itself was in transition. The stage was still dominant, but new inventions flickered at the edges of culture. Magic lanterns, zoetropes, experiments with moving images. These strange devices fascinated audiences hungry for novelty. Somewhere in that restless air, Florence's fate was already written, though neither she nor her mother could perceive it. She was a child of performance, and the moving picture would soon need such children to bring its shadows to life. As she grew, her talents blossomed, and she began to attract attention. Not yet the attention of the masses, but of those who saw in her a spark worth cultivating. She possessed not only the brightness of youth, but a seriousness beneath it, a discipline that many performers lacked. For Florence, performance was not mere play, but a calling, and she pursued it with a steadiness that belied her years. Was this her own will, or the will of her mother, guiding her through unseen hands? Again, we cannot know, and yet the question itself lingers, like a candle flame wavering in a draught. In Hamilton, Florence's life was both ordinary and extraordinary. She was a daughter, a girl among many, yet she carried within her the seed of something new. The city may not have seemed the cradle of cinema, but often history begins in unlikely places. The modest room where she was born, the simple stages on which she first appeared, would give rise to a phenomenon that would reshape culture across the world. It is a reminder that greatness often springs not from palaces, but from small houses lit by flickering candles. And so, as the candle burns lower, we imagine Florence lying awake at night, hearing the distant sound of applause in memory or imagination. Did she already dream of audiences unseen? Did she sense, even faintly, that her life would carry her far beyond these streets, into a world that had not yet been made? History does not record such thoughts, yet when we look back, we cannot help but wonder. The child's breath mingles with the candle's smoke, fragile and brief, yet within it is the first stirrings of a story that will unfold across continents and decades. The candlelight trembles one last time, its flame bending as if to whisper something before it vanishes. It fades into darkness, and in that darkness we hear something new, the distant echo of applause, faint but insistent, carried across time. The child who lay in candlelight will soon step into that applause, and though it will lift her high, it will also bind her more tightly than she can bear. The applause grows louder now, rolling toward us like waves upon a shore, and with it the shadows of moving images begin to stir. Florence is about to step into a world where her face will belong to millions, yet her name will remain hidden. The stage is set, the curtain quivers, and the audience leans forward. The applause swells, rolling like surf against a shore, and within its thunder, a new image flickers to life, the turning reels of a film projector, its whirring sound blending with the roar of unseen crowds. It is the first decade of the 20th century, and Florence Lawrence steps quietly onto the stage of a new invention that will alter not only her own life, but the very way human beings dream. She is still young, her features not yet hardened by time, her gaze carrying both innocence and resolve. Before her lies not the well-worn wooden boards of a vaudeville stage, but the strange, pale light of early cinema. When Florence began appearing in moving pictures, the idea of a film star did not exist. The films themselves were brief, often only minutes long, simple scenes stitched together without great ambition. The actors who filled them were anonymous, their faces familiar to audiences, but their names concealed. Studios believed that to name the performers would risk giving them power, allowing them to demand higher pay, perhaps even creative influence. And so, these figures were presented as shadows, loved but not acknowledged. Audiences gave them their affection but not their identity. Florence became the brightest of these shadows. Audiences knew her only as the Biograph Girl, for she appeared in countless productions of the Biograph Company, her presence steady and magnetic. Her face, projected larger than life, became recognizable across the continent. Men and women alike found themselves drawn to her expressions, her movements, the way she seemed to embody both joy and sorrow, with an immediacy that spoke to all. Yet no one could call her name. She was both everywhere and nowhere, seen by millions yet living behind a veil of silence. Imagine the paradox, to be adored by countless strangers, to have faces turned toward the screen in rapt attention whenever you appear, and yet to walk the streets without recognition, your name absent from the papers, your voice unheard. Did Florence find comfort in this anonymity, or did it wound her? Was there relief in being free of the burdens that would later come with fame, or was there an ache, a desire to be known fully and not merely as a flickering phantom? The silence of her early fame invites us to wonder. The whirring projector light falls across her, illuminating her dark hair, her expressive features. She plays roles swiftly, as films were made quickly and with little ceremony. In one, she is a young bride. In another, a daughter torn between duty and love. In yet another, a figure of comedy, light and playful. Her ability to shift between moods, to convey emotion without words, astonished audiences. In an age when spoken dialogue was absent, every feeling had to be carried in a glance, a gesture, the smallest turn of the hand. Florence mastered this language, and in doing so, she became not just a performer, but the embodiment of a new art form. Her anonymity, however, was not complete. Audiences began to ask for her by description, writing letters to studios, inquiring about the girl with the dark hair, the actress whose smile seems to know us. Soon, theater owners found themselves promoting films simply by promising the Biograph Girl would appear. A strange reversal occurred. The nameless star had become more powerful than the named production. Studios resisted, fearing the day when actors would demand salaries to match their popularity. But the tide of curiosity was unstoppable. To love someone's face without knowing their name was unbearable to the public, and they clamored for identity. For Florence, these years were a crucible. She worked tirelessly, appearing in hundreds of short films, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of early cinema. Yet beneath the surface, the tension grew. She was the most famous unknown woman in America, perhaps in the world, and fame, though intoxicating, grows heavy when it is bound to silence. We might pause here, in this moment of paradox, and reflect on the nature of recognition. Is a person truly seen when their face is adored, but their name is withheld? Does love without knowledge enrich or diminish the beloved? Florence's life in these years reminds us that to be recognized is not only to be looked at, but to be called forth, to be addressed as oneself. She lived in that uneasy twilight, half revealed, half hidden, beloved yet unnamed. The applause of audiences echoed beyond theaters, becoming letters, clippings, whispers. A new age was dawning, though few realized it. The age of celebrity, with all its brilliance and cruelty, would be born from this longing to know the performer behind the image. And at the very heart of this birth stood Florence Lawrence, unknowingly preparing to cross a threshold no one before her had crossed. Let us imagine her, after a long day on set, stepping into the cool evening air. The stage dust still clings to her dress. The scent of oil lamps and film reels lingers on her skin. She walks the streets like any other, unremarked by passers-by. Yet behind closed doors, audiences are watching her face, perhaps at that very moment flickering across a sheet hung in a small town hall. She's both invisible and omnipresent, a ghost and a goddess. What thoughts must have passed through her mind as she lived this double life? Did she sense that anonymity could not last forever, that the world was shifting beneath her feet? Or did she savor the simplicity, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the horizon? The applause continues, swelling ever louder, pressing against the silence of her namelessness. The tension builds until it can no longer hold, and soon the veil will tear, the first name will be spoken, and Florence Lawrence will step fully into the light of recognition. But for now, in this part of her journey, she remains the Biograph Girl, the most beloved stranger in the world. The whir of the projector grows softer now, as though winding down, the reel spinning toward its end. The light flickers, the film strip trembles, and with it, we hear a whisper. Her name, unspoken, yet pressing to be revealed. The reel stutters, and the whisper lingers unfinished, leaving us waiting for the moment when Florence Lawrence will at last become known. The whisper hovers in the dark, almost inaudible, then gathers weight until it shapes itself into sound. A name, Florence Lawrence. At last the nameless face is given form in letters that can be spoken aloud. The veil that shielded her breaks, and with it the silent contract between studio and audience shatters. For the first time, a performer in motion pictures is not only adored, but identified. A living person recognized beyond the frame. It is a moment small in itself, yet vast in consequence, for with the utterance of her name begins the long era of celebrity, as we know it, a chain of recognition that stretches from that first fragile announcement to the noise of fame today. How did it feel, one wonders, to hear her own name in the mouths of strangers, to see it printed where once only anonymity reigned? Did Florence tremble with pride, with relief, or with unease at the doors that fame had opened? To be known is a gift, yet it is also an exposure. The name once revealed cannot be withdrawn. It becomes a vessel into which countless others pour their dreams, their longings, their judgments. Her smile would now belong to millions, her image both celebrated and consumed. The story of how her name was first proclaimed has been told in many versions, yet all agree it was a turning point. Carl Laemmle, who would later found Universal Pictures, recognized the hunger of audiences to know the identity of the Biograph Girl. In 1910, he lured Florence away from Biograph, paying her more than any screen actress had received before. and in a daring move, he announced her departure publicly. It was not merely a matter of contract or salary. It was a declaration that the actress herself mattered, that she was not only a face, but a name, a star. In doing so, Lemmel set the precedent that would shape the industry for generations. The star system, the cult of personality, the selling of films not by story or invention, but by the magnetism of an individual. And Florence, willingly or not, became the first to bear that weight. She was advertised in newspapers by name. Crowds flocked to theaters not to see an anonymous story, but to see Florence Lawrence. Reporters sought her interviews, photographers her likeness. She was no longer a phantom flickering on the screen. She was flesh and blood, adored in life as well as in film. For a time, she stood at the pinnacle, basking in a recognition no actor before her had known. We might pause and consider the magnitude of this shift. Before Florence, film actors were tools of the studio, replaceable, silent. After her, they became commodities in themselves, centers of attention, idols upon whom audiences projected longing and admiration. She was not simply the first star, she was the very spark that created the notion of stardom. To this day, every actor whose name appears in lights follows in the shadow of that first illumination. And yet, like all lights, it came at a cost. For Florence, the sudden blaze of fame was exhilarating, but also perilous. She became the subject of publicity stunts, of promotions designed to draw attention not to the art of cinema, but to her person. At one point, rumors were spread that she had died in an accident, only for her to appear dramatically at a theater to disprove them, a spectacle staged to amplify her notoriety. It was both triumph and humiliation, for while she lived, she now lived as spectacle. She was no longer wholly herself. She was property of the public, a name on their tongues, a face in their minds. Did she sense the danger? Did she feel behind the cheering crowds the faint chill of a trap? For fame once acquired cannot be undone, and recognition once given cannot be recalled. She had stepped into a light that would not dim until it consumed her. Yet perhaps she also felt joy, pride at being chosen, at being the one who opened the gate for all who would follow. To be the first is to be both pioneer and sacrifice, and Florence was both at once. In those years, the height of her stardom, she worked ceaselessly. Each new role expanded her reach. Each new publicity piece deepened her image. She was admired not only for her beauty, but for her versatility, her ability to embody sorrow, comedy, tenderness, and resolve. Audiences saw in her something of themselves, yet also something more, a figure larger than life. The papers called her America's sweetheart, the girl everyone knows, and yet in private she remained a woman with her own hopes, her own frailties. The gap between image and self widened, and into that gap poured both admiration and loneliness. It is here that reflection rises again. What does it mean to be the first star when no path yet exists, when no warning has been given, when the machinery of fame is still raw and untested? Florence lived the question without knowing it. She bore the untried burden of celebrity, with no map to guide her, no examples to learn from. Every triumph she experienced was also an experiment, and every wound she suffered became precedent for those who came after. Her life was both gift and caution, both celebration and lament. As her name spread across headlines, her world shifted. No longer did she walk unrecognized in the streets. Strangers knew her, called to her, sought her presence. She belonged not only to herself, but to the countless eyes that now claimed her. The silence of anonymity was gone forever. In its place came noise, constant and insistent. For some, such noise is intoxicating. For others, unbearable. For Florence, it was both, a mixture of pride and unease. And so, we leave her here for a moment, standing in the blaze of recognition, her name spoken for the first time as a star. She is radiant, admired at the crest of her power, Yet even as she shines, shadows gather at the edges, for fame, once given, demands more than it bestows. The applause that once longed for her name now hungers for her image, her story, her very life. The whisper of her name fades into a roar, and within that roar we hear the crowd calling not just for Florence Lawrence, but for all that she represents. Her name, now illuminated, begins to blur into an advertisement, into a product, and as we listen, the roar grows deeper, heavier, like waves crashing upon stone. The crowd stretches hands toward her, not to hold but to possess, and she cannot know that the adoration which lifts her will one day consume her. The voices swell, echoing through the years, until they become indistinct, no longer names or words but a sound, a rising murmur like wind through countless leaves. That murmur lingers in the air, unresolved, waiting to reveal its next form. The murmur of the crowd, at first scattered and indistinct, deepens until it resembles the rush of leaves in a storm, and then steadies into a roar that fills the air. It is no longer the applause of a theater, but the ceaseless hum of commerce, of advertisements and billboards, of newspapers hawking not only stories, but faces. Within this roar, Florence Lawrence finds herself transformed yet again. She is no longer only an actress. She is a commodity, a name and image sold across the land, attached not only to films but to the countless objects of modern life. Her presence, once fleeting on the screen, now clings to products, to slogans, to the very idea of modern consumption. Florence, America's first movie star, becomes also one of its first commercial icons. Her smile promises not only entertainment, but safety, beauty, progress. She appears in advertisements for cosmetics, her luminous face suggesting that others might share in her glow if they only purchased the right powder or cream. She lends her name to new technologies, even to automobiles, a symbol of speed and the future. Her likeness, once reserved for flickering reels, now stares from print, from posters, from store windows. The crowd that once adored her in theaters now carries her image into their homes, into their daily routines. What does it mean, we may wonder, to have one's identity stretch so far, dispersed into bottles and pamphlets, tied to things one never touched? To be recognized not only for who one is, but for what one sells. Florence could not have known that this moment, her moment, would set the pattern for all who came after. The celebrity endorsement, the commodified persona, the endless recycling of image into product, all of it began here, with her. The first star became also the first advertisement. Perhaps she took pride in it, seeing her fame multiplied, her influence extending beyond the cinema into every corner of life. Perhaps she enjoyed the novelty, the strange thrill of seeing her face beside a product in a shop. Or perhaps there was unease, a quiet recognition that her image had slipped from her hands, that she no longer wholly owned herself. Fame had lifted her high, but in lifting, it had also taken. The smile she offered to the camera now belonged to others, endlessly reproduced, detached from the woman herself. We might pause here to reflect on the peculiar intimacy of this transformation. For audiences, Florence was no longer only a performer. She was a companion in their daily lives, a presence woven into their possessions, their choices, their sense of what it meant to live in a modern world. To place her face upon a product was to suggest that she, the beloved star, stood beside them in their ordinary tasks. The line between art and commerce blurred, between admiration and possession dissolved. She was not only seen, she was consumed. In these years, her fame reached its brightest blaze. Crowds gathered wherever she appeared. Theaters announced her name in bold letters, and films with her presence drew audiences eager not for the story, but for her. She was not merely one among many. She was the symbol, the proof that cinema had birthed a new kind of power. And yet, hidden within this triumph, the seeds of decline were already sown. For once the image becomes product, Once the star becomes commodity, she becomes also replaceable. The system that lifted her could, in time, discard her and seek another face, another name to attach to its goods. Did Florence sense this transience even in her glory? Did she lie awake in quiet nights, listening to the hum of the city, and wonder whether the love of the crowd could endure? Or did she, like so many who come first, believe that her light would shine forever? The truth remains elusive, suspended in the silence between photographs and letters, glimpsed only in fragments. Yet her later years suggest she knew, if only dimly, that fame's embrace was never gentle, that adoration was always tinged with hunger. Still, in those peak years, she dazzled. Newspapers described her as radiant, gracious, endlessly charming. Admirers wrote letters filled with longing, with reverence, with the strange intimacy of those who believe they know one they have never met. She became a mirror in which the public saw themselves, yet she remained, always, apart. The very products she endorsed promised closeness, yet in truth, they only widened the gap. For Florence was not in the bottle of powder or the polished surface of a motor car. She was elsewhere, unseen, living a life both magnified and diminished by the image projected of her. The roar of commerce, like the roar of the sea, never ceases. It carried her high, but it also drowned her own voice. What she thought, what she felt, became secondary to what she represented. She had become symbol more than self. And as history has shown again and again, symbols are both venerated and disposable. To be first is to be honored in memory, but often sacrificed in life. Her fame in those years shimmered like sunlight on water, bright, dazzling, yet impossible to hold. And as with all sunlight, shadows lengthened. Her marriages faltered, her health grew fragile, her fortune began to strain under missteps. The smile that sold products could not secure happiness in private. Behind the bright advertisements lay a woman searching for stability, for love, for something not written by others. The roar of the crowd, once joyous, takes on a different tone as we listen more closely. It is not only applause but demand, not only admiration but expectation. The voices that once cried out her name now clamor for more films, more appearances, more presence in their lives. The roar becomes insistent, like waves striking rock again and again, unceasing, relentless. And in the midst of it, Florence's own voice grows harder to hear. The sound lingers deep and heavy until it is no longer voices at all but a single door closing with a long echo. That echo carries us forward into the realm of her private life, her attempts at companionship, her marriages that faltered beneath the weight of fame. The door remains closed, but we stand before it, listening for the next chapter to begin. The echo of the closing door lingers, hollow and long, as though the wood itself remembers the sound of footsteps passing away. Behind each closed door, in Florence Lawrence's life, lay the hope of companionship, the dream that love might offer what fame could not. Yet the echo also carried disappointment, for the doors that opened so eagerly in passion seemed always to close again in silence. She had been the first star of the screen, but in her private world she was no less vulnerable than any soul who seeks warmth and finds only the cool touch of absence. Florence married more than once, and each time the promise of stability glimmered before her, only to dissolve into estrangement or discord. Fame may have opened those doors quickly, but it also shut them more firmly. For to live beside one who belongs not to a household, but to the world is no simple thing. Audiences may adore from a distance, but a partner must live with the weight of that adoration, the endless comparisons, the knowledge that one's beloved is already possessed, in a manner, by countless unseen others. In this tension, love struggles to breathe. Her first marriage, to actor Harry Solter, began in the brightness of shared purpose. They worked together in film, companions not only in affection but in craft. For a time, they seemed well matched. two souls navigating the new frontier of cinema side by side. Yet even in partnership, shadows grew. Fame leaned more heavily upon Florence than upon Harry. An imbalance crept between them. Did he resent her ascendancy, the way her name eclipsed his? Or did she, so accustomed to being first, find it difficult to dwell in equality? History gives us only fragments, yet the fragments whisper of strain. The marriage, begun in harmony, ended in separation. Later unions followed, each promising renewal, each leaving traces of disappointment. Her second marriage to automobile salesman Charles Woodruff was brief. Another door opened only to close again. Her third to actor and salesman Henry Bolton proved more than disappointment. It was bruising, marked by cruelty and violence. From that union she withdrew, carrying not companionship but wounds, a deeper solitude than before. The pattern repeated: hope, disillusionment, retreat. The star who had illuminated the screens of the world found her own hearth dim, her nights empty of the warmth she sought. It is tempting as storytellers to imagine her sighing before a mirror, makeup removed, staring at her own reflection with the question, why not me? Why not love when the world itself loves me? But perhaps her thoughts were quieter, less dramatic. Perhaps she simply endured, carrying on as one carries a hidden ache, unseen yet constant. For loneliness does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, day after day, until it becomes the background against which all else is lived. We may reflect here on the cruel paradox of fame. It multiplies attention, yet diminishes intimacy. The more eyes that gaze upon you, the harder it becomes to be seen by one pair with clarity. To millions, Florence was a vision, a dream, a presence larger than life. To herself, she was a woman longing for tenderness, for constancy, for the ordinary joys of companionship. The gap between the image and the self yawned wide, and love could not cross it. Yet within these faltering unions there must also have been moments of sweetness, shared laughter, quiet evenings, perhaps the simple joy of walking unnoticed in a park. Such moments are seldom recorded, yet they matter, for they remind us that even the most storied lives are stitched together by threads of ordinariness. Florence was a star, yes, but she was also a woman who tried again and again to find home in the heart of another. Her failures in love do not diminish her, they make her more recognizably human. Still, the doors kept closing. Each closing left her more solitary, more exposed to the winds of public life. Without the anchor of companionship, the storms of fame pressed more harshly upon her. She gave herself to her work, to invention, to appearances, yet none of these could fill the quiet spaces of her heart. The silence of her house at night, the sound of her own footsteps returning without welcome, these must have weighed heavily. We might ask, was it the fate of all pioneers to walk alone? To be first is to move where no path exists, and those who follow may walk together, but the one ahead often finds only solitude. Florence had blazed the trail of celebrity, and perhaps loneliness was the price exacted by that pioneering. She showed the world how to adore, but she herself was never fully adored in the way she most needed. The echo of the closing door fades, yet the sound remains in the mind, reverberating with all it suggests. Behind it lies the image of Florence sitting quietly, listening for a step that does not come, a key that does not turn, a voice that does not call. And as we lean closer, that silence deepens until it transforms into another sound altogether. The clatter not of doors, but of drums, of distant bugles, the rising tumult of war. For the world itself was shifting, and the stage upon which Florence played her life was about to change. The echo gives way to the low rumble of conflict, the great war stirring across the ocean, reshaping culture, industry, and the very rhythm of entertainment. As nations turned toward battle, cinema itself would be called to serve as messenger and propaganda, and Florence, like so many others, would find her place altered by history's tide. The door of private life has closed, and now a new door opens, the door of war and its consequences. The sound of its hinge creaks in the air, unresolved, awaiting the step that will carry us through. The distant rumble of drums grows louder, no longer a faint echo behind a closed door, but a steady thunder rolling across continents. The year is 1914, and the Great War has broken upon the world. Though the battles rage far from Hollywood's quiet hills, the tremors reach even here, reshaping the paths of those who make their living in stories and illusions. Cinema, still a young art, finds itself enlisted as messenger and persuader, a tool to rally spirits, to inspire patriotism, to bind audiences to the cause of nations. And Florence Lawrence, who once stood at the pinnacle of celebrity, feels the ground shift beneath her feet. In the war years, the public's appetite began to change. The light comedies and sentimental dramas of the past gave way to grander themes, to narratives of sacrifice, courage, and national unity. Younger faces emerged, their freshness matching the restless energy of a new age. Florence, though still admired, no longer stood alone at the summit. The machine she had helped to create now produced new stars, one after another, each drawing crowds, each diluting the singular power she once held. To be first is to be unique, but once the floodgates open, the current sweeps forward, carrying others who soon overtake. She continued to work, appearing in films, lending her presence to the shifting demands of the industry. Yet her roles grew smaller, her name less prominently displayed. Audiences still recognized her, still remembered the Biograph Girl. But memory is a fragile currency in a world that constantly seeks the new. The very invention of celebrity that had elevated her now turned against her, demanding novelty, discarding the old for the promise of youth. Florence was only in her 30s, but the screen, cruel in its pace, had already begun to call her a relic of yesterday. Did she feel bitterness as she watched younger actresses step into the light she had once monopolized? Or did she accept it with a kind of weary dignity, knowing that the crown of firsts is always temporary? Perhaps both, for she was human, and the human heart does not surrender its longing easily. To have been adored so greatly, and then to feel that adoration wane is a wound few can carry without scar. And yet she persevered, holding to her craft, offering what she could even as the world's gaze turned elsewhere. The war years also brought hardship in other ways. The industry grew harsher, more mechanized, less intimate. What had once been small productions, personal and improvisational, became increasingly industrial, with larger studios, stricter hierarchies, and relentless schedules. Florence, who had thrived in the freer atmosphere of early cinema, may have found herself ill at ease in this new environment. The intimacy of being known to all was replaced by the anonymity of being one among many, the machinery grinding forward regardless of who stood before the camera. And beyond the screen, her personal struggles compounded the weight. Her marriages faltered, her finances strained, her health began to trouble her. The brightness of her name, though still glowing, flickered at the edges. Audiences, preoccupied with the world's upheaval, sought new symbols, new idols. Florence had been the face of cinema's dawn, but cinema was already entering its noon, and dawn was becoming memory. It is here we may reflect on the merciless rhythm of novelty. Human beings crave the new, the untried, the fresh. Yesterday's wonder becomes today's ordinary, and what once drew gasps now elicits only a nod. Florence's fate illustrates this rhythm with cruel clarity. She was adored not because she was eternal, but because she was first, and firstness cannot be repeated. Once the pattern is established, the pioneer becomes part of the past, admired perhaps, but always overshadowed by those who follow. Yet even in this decline, there is a kind of nobility. For Florence did not simply vanish, she continued to contribute, to lend her presence, to endure the shifts. She did not retreat into silence immediately, but fought to remain part of the art she had helped birth. That resilience, though less celebrated, deserves remembrance. It is easier to honor triumph than persistence, but persistence may be the truer measure of character. Still, the world moved on. The sound of war, the newness of rising stars, the changing appetite of audiences, all conspired to dim her flame. She must have sensed it, watching premieres where her name no longer shone brightest, reading newspapers where her image was relegated to smaller corners. And yet, perhaps at night, alone in her room, she recalled the roar of the first crowds, the thrill of seeing her name proclaimed, the heady knowledge that she had been the first. Memory may have been both solace and torment, a reminder of what once was and could never return. The drums of war continued until 1918, and when the guns fell silent, the world was altered beyond recognition. The film industry, too, had been transformed, larger than before, more powerful, more ruthless. Florence, though still alive and still working, found herself drifting further to the margins. She had been the spark that lit the fire, but the blaze now roared without her. And so, the rumble that began with war became, for Florence, the rumble of decline, the distant thunder of change that could not be stopped. She was not forgotten, not yet, but she was no longer at the center. The spotlight that once followed her every gesture now swept past, searching for newer faces, fresher promises. To be first is to blaze briefly. The world does not pause to honor, but moves ever forward. The thunder softens now, fading into the sound of paper, a calendar page lifted by a draft, tearing gently as it falls to the floor. The war is over, the 20s approach, and with them a new era of cinema, more dazzling, more merciless. The page drifts downward, carrying Florence into the next chapter of her life, where fortune will waver and her decline will deepen. The calendar page turns as if carried by a draft of unseen air, drifting slowly downward until it settles on the wooden floor. The year is no longer shaded by the thunder of war, but bathed in the restless brightness of the 1920s. The world has survived its great conflict, and with survival has come a hunger for speed, for novelty, for abundance. Jazz trembles in the air, motor cars roar along new roads, and cinema itself grows ever larger, louder, more dazzling. Yet for Florence Lawrence, the page that has fallen marks not renewal, but decline. The 1920s belonged to youth, to energy, to the fresh faces that crowded into Hollywood with dreams of stardom. Studios, grown more powerful and disciplined, became factories of image, selecting, polishing, discarding with a ruthless efficiency. Florence, once the singular beacon of cinema, found herself one among many, her star no longer commanding the horizon. She was still remembered, yes, but memory in Hollywood is a fragile thing, quickly overshadowed by the brilliance of the present. The title of first movie star carried honor, but honor did not fill theaters. Audiences wanted the new, and the system was all too ready to provide it. At the same time, Florence's financial foundation began to crumble. Investments that once promised stability dissolved into loss. She placed her faith in ventures that faltered, money slipping through her hands like sand. The wealth she had earned in her brightest years dwindled, and with it her sense of security. The industry she had helped create no longer offered her the same opportunities, and her private fortune no longer sheltered her from hardship. She, who had once been the highest-paid actress of her time, found herself calculating expenses, worrying over bills, dependent on the uncertain kindness of others. One might imagine her in those years, seated at a small desk, papers spread before her, the lamplight flickering as she tried to reconcile what remained of her fortune. The memory of applause must have felt very distant, replaced by the clink of coins, the scratch of ink, the uneasy silence of an empty house. To go from being adored by millions to tallying dollars alone, What thoughts must have stirred in her mind? Did she resent the system that had cast her aside? Did she curse her own missteps in money, in trust? Or did she endure quietly, as she had endured so many other disappointments, with a kind of weary grace? The decade was not without its glimmers. Florence still appeared occasionally in films, though never again at the center. She still walked the streets of Hollywood, where some recognized her, others did not. Yet these moments carried an air of ghostliness, as though she moved through a world that had already forgotten her place in it. The very system she had helped inaugurate was now a machine in which she was but a faint trace, easily overlooked. The crowds that once surged toward her had shifted to new idols, and Florence, though still living, had become part of cinema's past. There is a peculiar cruelty in such forgetting. To the public, it seems natural, the inevitable march of novelty. To the one forgotten, it is a slow erasure, a fading that feels almost like a second death. Florence, still not yet old, experienced this erasure while she could still remember vividly the days of her glory. She carried in her body the memory of standing at the center, even as the world placed her at the edge. That contrast is perhaps more painful than obscurity itself. And yet, in this period of decline, Florence did not vanish entirely into despair. She remained inventive, resourceful, searching for ways to contribute. In 1914, she had patented an early design for an automobile signaling device, an arm that could be raised or lowered to indicate a turn, a forerunner of modern indicators. Though this invention brought her little financial return, it revealed her restless intelligence, her desire to improve the world around her, to leave a mark beyond the screen. It is easy to forget this. Florence, the inventor, the mind at work behind the face. The system remembered her only for her beauty, but she herself was more than beauty. Still, the losses accumulated. The brightness of the 20s, with its dance halls and electric lights, passed her by. She was not among the flappers, not among the new faces splashed across newspapers. She belonged to an earlier moment, and Hollywood, with its relentless appetite, had no use for what was earlier. In those years, she drifted further into obscurity, her name mentioned occasionally with nostalgia, but rarely with urgency. She had been the dawn, and now the sun stood overhead, blazing on others. We may pause here to consider the nature of pioneering. To be the first is to open a path, but the path once opened no longer belongs to the pioneer. It belongs to those who follow, who walk it with greater ease, who reap more fully the benefits. Florence had borne the weight of anonymity, of transition, of invention. Those who came after her enjoyed the smoother path she carved, and yet in the public mind, her name receded while theirs endured. This is the paradox of being first, to be indispensable to history, yet dispensable to memory. As the 1920s drew on, Florence's hardships grew heavier. The industry she had helped raise treated her as an afterthought, and her financial misfortunes deepened. Yet even in her sorrow, she remained a symbol, if only to a few who remembered. For those who looked back, she was a reminder of beginnings, of a time when cinema was young, and her face was its first revelation. That memory, faint though it was, kept her from vanishing entirely, even as her daily life grew more precarious. The calendar page that had drifted down now stirs again, lifted by another draft. It rustles, carrying with it not the bustle of commerce, but a quieter sound, the soft clinking of rosary beads in patient fingers. Florence's fortunes may have waned, but her spirit sought other forms of solace: faith, ritual, the quiet turning of beads between her hands. As the 1930s approached, her health began to fail, her body carrying scars of accidents and illness. The sound of coins had given way to the sound of beads, prayers whispered into the silence of a lonely room. The beads slip softly, one after another, and the whisper of prayer lingers in the air, unresolved. The candle that once lit her birth has burned low, and now another small flame wavers in the shadows, not of triumph, but of endurance. The beads slipped gently through her fingers, each one a small globe worn smooth by touch, each a silent companion in the stillness of her room. The whisper of prayer drifts softly, half spoken, half thought, a rhythm against the silence. Florence Lawrence, once the most luminous face on the silver screen, now leans upon ritual, upon the simple repetition of words that promise order when all else is unsteady. Outside, the world of the 1930s races forward, but within her small home, time moves differently, measured not by applause or contracts, but by the slow turning of beads and the uneven pulse of her frail body. Her health, never strong after accidents and years of strain, begins to falter more openly. She had suffered burns in a studio fire years before, her body marked by scars that never quite healed. Illness followed her, pain that lingered, exhaustion that deepened. Doctors gave their prescriptions, but relief was fleeting. The woman who once embodied vigor and grace on screen now struggled simply to move through her days. Pain became a constant, a dull undertone beneath every action, a weight that dimmed her once bright energy. And yet, she endured. The same resilience that had carried her through the harshness of fame carried her now through the harsher quiet of obscurity. She had learned early in life that survival required not only talent, but persistence, and she clung to persistence as her last possession. Each morning she rose, tended to her home, and sought comfort in small things. The pattern of sunlight through curtains, the warmth of a cup held between her hands, the texture of the beads as they passed through her fingers. These small mercies, though modest, became her anchors. The world outside her door bore little resemblance to the world she had once ruled. Sound films had come, sweeping aside the silent era in which she had shone. New stars had risen and flourished, their voices filling theaters, their names filling newspapers. The Hollywood of the 1930s was grander, harsher, a machine of enormous power that had little memory for its pioneers. Florence, who had once been the very embodiment of stardom, lived now as if invisible. Few remembered her. Fewer still sought her out. To most, she was a figure of the past, a name faintly recalled, if recalled at all. We may pause to consider the cruelty of such forgetting, how swiftly a society that creates idols casts them aside when novelty fades. Florence's life was a testament to this truth. She had been the first, the pioneer, the one who proved that an actor's name could sell films, that a face could bind an audience. Yet within a generation she was forgotten, left to endure her decline alone. Memory is as fickle as fame, and Florence was caught between the two, clinging to fragments of recognition even as they slipped away. Her loneliness deepened in these years. Marriages had failed, family ties were tenuous, and friendships in Hollywood, so often bound to usefulness, had long since frayed. She lived quietly, almost anonymously, though the irony must not have been lost on her. She had once been the most famous unknown woman in the world, beloved as the Biograph Girl without a name. Now she was the opposite. She had a name, Florence Lawrence, known in history if not in life, but her present existence was unseen, unacknowledged. To be invisible twice in one lifetime, first through anonymity, then through obscurity, was perhaps the sharpest irony of all. Still, she found ways to endure: faith, small rituals, brief visits from those who remembered. Sometimes she returned to sets, not as a star, but in small roles, background parts that offered a trace of belonging. For a woman who had once stood at the center, even the periphery was something. Perhaps it gave her a sense of continuity, a thread connecting her present to the glory of her past. To walk again beneath studio lights, even unnoticed, was to walk once more on familiar ground. Her inventions, too, lingered as a private solace. The memory of her automobile signaling arm, her efforts to improve safety, reminded her that she had left her mark not only in the realm of art, but in the practical world as well. She had contributed in ways unseen by most to the fabric of modern life. Though she never received wealth or recognition for it, the thought may have steadied her. She had not been entirely consumed by the screen. Yet the pain remained, growing heavier as the decade wore on. Illness confined her more often, and financial troubles continued to press. The system that had raised her offered no pension, no care for its pioneers. She, like so many others of her generation, was left to manage as best she could, a figure once radiant now dwindling in comfort, but not in dignity. We might imagine her in these years, sitting by a small window, watching the light fade from afternoon to dusk. Perhaps she heard the distant hum of cars, the laughter of neighbors, the faint crackle of a radio playing a new song. These sounds of modern life must have seemed both familiar and alien, reminders that time had not stopped, though she herself felt paused. Did she think of the young woman she had been, stepping before cameras, unaware of the costs that would follow? Did she see her life as triumph, or as tragedy, or as some mixture too complex to name? The beads slip again, one by one, her fingers moving almost automatically, prayer mingling with memory. Each bead carries the weight of a moment, a breath, a hope. Yet as they fall, as they pass through her hands, there is also a sense of inevitability, of time moving steadily toward an end. The whisper of prayer fades now, and in the silence we hear another sound, the faint squeal of a studio gate turning on its hinges. The world of cinema, still thriving, still bustling with youth and promise, lies just beyond, though Florence walks its edges like a ghost. The gate creaks open, inviting yet indifferent, and the sound hangs unresolved in the air, a threshold waiting to be crossed. The gate creaks on its old hinges, the sound rising into the warm California air, and for a moment it seems almost to breathe, as if the studios themselves were alive, pulsing with the vigor of youth and novelty. Beyond those gates lies the kingdom Florence once ruled, though now she enters not as sovereign but as a ghost of memory. The new stars hurry past, bright and restless, their voices lifted in laughter, their eyes wide with the hunger of ambition. Few notice her. To them, she is another passerby, an older woman walking with measured step, her face vaguely familiar but unplaceable. They do not know that the path they tread was first cleared by her own. She walks slowly, pausing at corners where she once waited for her call, gazing at the sound stages that have grown larger, more imposing, filled with equipment she never knew. In her day, the work was improvisation, raw invention. Now it is industry, vast and precise, a factory of dreams where thousands labor to produce illusions on a scale unimaginable 20 years earlier. Florence watches the bustle with quiet eyes. It is not bitterness she feels, nor even envy, but a curious detachment, as though she were observing a world both familiar and foreign, belonging to her, and yet not hers. Sometimes she is called back, offered a small role, a bit part in the background of a film. These invitations are modest, often unnoticed by audiences, but to Florence, they are threads connecting her present to her past. When she steps onto a set, even as an extra, she breathes again the scent of grease paint, hears again the clatter of cameras, feels again the warmth of light upon her face. It is not glory, but it is continuity. And perhaps that is enough. To walk again among the reels and lamps, even without recognition, is to affirm that she has not been wholly erased. Yet she remains on the margins, watching as others take the center she once held. Young actresses, radiant and ambitious, become the faces on billboards, the voices in the papers. They smile as she once smiled, they pose as she once posed, they hear their names called in adoration. Florence sees in them both her reflection and her replacement. They are the children of the system she birthed, and though she might wish to resent them, perhaps she feels only kinship. They too will learn the fickleness of applause. They too will one day walk unnoticed, their names replaced by others. She, who has lived it, knows this better than they. There is a dignity in her quiet wandering. Though the world has forgotten her, she has not forgotten herself. She knows what she was, what she gave, what she endured. Her memory is her own, even if no one else recalls it. She walks the studio edges like a guardian spirit, invisible yet enduring, her presence woven into the very air. For every star who shines, there must have been one who first showed the way, and Florence remains that figure, whether acknowledged or not. And yet solitude weighs heavily. To be unseen in the midst of brightness is perhaps lonelier than to be unseen in darkness. The chatter of actors, the calls of directors, the roar of cameras, all these sounds surround her, yet none are addressed to her. She stands in a world alive with voices, yet her own voice is unheard. Fame, once overwhelming, has left her with silence, and the contrast is sharp. She bears it with composure, but within her, the ache of invisibility lingers. We might pause here and reflect on the nature of presence. What does it mean to be present in a world that no longer acknowledges you? Florence's life in these years suggests that presence is not only about recognition, but also about endurance. She endured, even as others ignored her. She remained, even as others passed by. There is a quiet strength in this, a strength less celebrated than glory, but perhaps more profound. Still, the world outside the gates moved on. The Great Depression deepened, pressing hardship upon millions, and Florence felt its weight as keenly as anyone. Her savings, already diminished, grew smaller still. The occasional film roles offered little pay, scarcely enough to cover necessities. She lived frugally, carefully, dependent sometimes on charity, sometimes on the kindness of those who remembered. For one who had once been adored by millions, the descent into financial precarity must have felt both humbling and cruel. Yet even here, she found small comforts. She tended her garden, walked quietly through her neighborhood, exchanged polite words with neighbors. In such ordinary acts lay a form of resistance. She continued to live, to take her place in the world, however modest. Though forgotten by the industry, she did not allow herself to be wholly erased. And perhaps there were moments, rare but luminous, when someone recognized her, an older fan, a passerby who recalled her face. In such moments, she would have seen flicker across their expression the memory of her former glory, the recognition that she was once the one who began it all. Those moments, brief and fleeting, must have been bittersweet, for they confirmed both her importance and her obscurity. She was remembered, but only faintly, only in fragments. The studio gate creaks again, closing behind her as she walks away. The laughter and bustle fade into the distance, replaced by the quiet rhythm of her footsteps. Evening descends, shadows lengthening across the streets. In the window of a shop, she glimpses her reflection, and for a moment she sees not the older woman she has become, but the girl she once was, luminous, smiling, filled with promise. The image trembles in the glass, caught between past and present, between memory and reality. The reflection lingers shimmering faintly until it fades with the dimming light, and in its place another glow appears, the faint red of a lamp, glowing steady against the night. It is not the light of the screen, not the glare of fame, but a signal, an invention she once dreamed into being, now guiding strangers on darkened roads. The red glow lingers, unresolved, a reminder that her touch remains even when her name is forgotten. The faint red glow lingers in the night, steady and patient, like an ember refusing to fade. It is not the brilliance of a spotlight nor the flash of a marquee, but the quiet illumination of a signal lamp, a small invention guiding unseen travelers on darkened roads. And within that glow, we remember Florence Lawrence not as a star, but as an inventor, a mind restless beyond performance, a woman who sought to shape the world not only through her image, but through her thought. Long before such devices became commonplace, Florence imagined a way for automobiles to communicate more clearly, to signal intentions in a language of light and movement. The roadways of her day were chaotic, filled with machines still new to daily life, their speed outpacing the habits of horse and carriage. Accidents were frequent, confusion common. Florence, ever observant, saw the peril and conceived a solution, an arm that could be raised or lowered from the rear of the car indicating a turn. It was a simple gesture, mechanical yet eloquent, an extension of the driver's will translated into visible motion. In 1914, she patented this design, the first step toward what we now know as the turn signal. Later, she proposed a brake signal as well, a warning that would appear when a driver slowed, offering safety to those who followed. These ideas were ahead of their time, practical and far-sighted, yet they brought her little profit and little recognition. The automobile industry, like the film industry, was quick to adopt ideas but slow to honor their originators. Florence's contributions slipped into use without her name attached, absorbed into the machinery of progress as if they had always existed. One might imagine her watching years later as cars on crowded streets lifted small arms or flashed lights to indicate turns. Did she feel pride, knowing she had been there at the beginning? Or bitterness, seeing her innovation forgotten, her name absent from its history? Perhaps both. Yet pride may have outweighed bitterness, for to know that one has improved the world, even without acknowledgement, is a satisfaction few can claim. Here lies a quieter truth about Florence. She was not merely an image projected onto screens, but a mind attentive to the world, capable of invention, eager to solve problems. The studios may have treated her as a commodity, but she was more than that. Her invention reveals her as practical, thoughtful, engaged not only with the illusion of cinema, but with the realities of life. To reduce her only to the first movie star is to see only part of her, the part that suited history's appetite for spectacle. The other part, the part that shaped tools of safety, remains largely hidden, glowing faintly like that red lamp against the night. We may pause here and reflect on how society remembers. We celebrate faces, names, images, but often overlook the quieter gifts, the contributions that shape daily life without ceremony. Florence's signal device did not dazzle like her smile on screen, but it may have saved lives, prevented collisions, spared countless unknown sorrows. Which is the greater legacy, the fleeting joy of her films or the enduring safety of her invention? History rarely answers such questions. It simply remembers what it chooses. Yet as we stand within her story, we can honor both. Florence's inventive spirit, though overshadowed by her stardom, tells us something deeper about her character. She was not content simply to be adored. She wanted to create, to contribute, to matter beyond the screen. This desire connects her to countless pioneers whose names are forgotten, though their works endure. It is a humbler form of immortality, one that does not depend on applause but on usefulness. And perhaps, in her solitude, she found comfort in knowing that somewhere, on some dark road, her thought lived on in the glow of a small red light. Yet even this comfort was fragile. Recognition did not come, money did not flow, and her daily life remained marked by struggle. The invention that might have secured her was instead absorbed by others, leaving her to continue her quiet fight for survival. The red glow in the night is not triumph, but reminder. She had within her the power to change the world, yet the world did not grant her its due. Still, there is beauty in imagining her mind at work, sketching ideas, tinkering with possibilities, seeking not fame, but function. In those moments, she was free of the burden of image, free of the hunger of the crowd. She was simply a woman thinking, creating, giving shape to ideas. That, too, was Florence Lawrence, and it deserves remembrance. The red glow pulses once more, steady and unresolved, until it begins to fade into shadow. And within that shadow, another hue arises, not the calm red of safety, but the darker shade of shame, of dependence, of poverty pressing close. For as the years lengthened, Florence found herself increasingly dependent on the charity of others, her name forgotten by the industry she had helped to build. Her contribution as inventor lay unacknowledged, and her legacy as star lay neglected. What remained was hardship, the daily struggle to endure in a world that had moved on. The glow darkens, and in its place we hear the sound of footsteps in dust, faint and receding. The dust stirs with each step, rising into the air, carrying the weight of time. Florence walks within it, quieter now, her presence diminished but not gone. The sound lingers, unresolved, like a life still moving but already marked by the shadow of decline. The footsteps move softly through the dust, each one fading a little more than the last, until the air itself seems to grow heavy with silence. Florence Lawrence, who once moved amid roars of applause, now walks in quieter places, her presence reduced to the shuffle of a life lived in the margins. The dust that rises behind her is not the golden haze of a stage, but the dry residue of years, the sign of a life overlooked, left to settle where no one pays heed. By the 1930s, her world had contracted. Once she had been carried in the pages of newspapers, her image sold across nations. Now she lived in a small house, modest to the point of invisibility, her income sparse, her comforts few. Hollywood, which had once depended upon her face, passed by her door without pause. The industry gave no pensions to its pioneers, no honor to those who had made it possible. Florence lived as so many of the early stars lived, quietly, without means, forgotten. The hardship was practical as well as spiritual. Money was scarce, and what little she earned through minor appearances or odd work was never enough to secure lasting ease. She depended often on the generosity of others, those rare souls who still remembered, who still recognized in her the significance of being first. But such charity was never steady, and Florence endured the anxiety of uncertainty, never sure what tomorrow might hold. It was a cruel irony. The woman who had once embodied abundance, who had been adored by millions, now counted coins at her table, wondering if she could meet her needs. Dependence carries with it not only struggle, but shame. Florence, whose fame had rested upon independence, upon being the face who commanded attention, now found herself asking, waiting, hoping for help. The humiliation of such dependence weighed heavily, for pride and dignity remained strong in her. She did not complain publicly, she bore her lot with quiet endurance. But within her, the contrast must have been sharp. She had given so much to the screen, to the public, and now the public had nothing to give back. The silence of her house pressed upon her. No longer did voices call her to set, no longer did cameras whir to life at her entrance. Instead, there were empty rooms, the faint tick of a clock, the occasional creak of boards beneath her step. Solitude, once perhaps a refuge, became more oppressive. Her life narrowed, her circle grew smaller until she was left mostly with her own thoughts, her own memories. To live among ghosts of applause is to live half in the past and half in a present that feels unsteady. And yet, through all of this, there was a persistence in her. She did not vanish entirely into despair. She continued to appear in small ways, continued to seek meaning. Even in her hardships, she clung to dignity, never descending into self-pity in public, never surrendering wholly to bitterness. The strength she carried as a pioneer was still within her, even as her circumstances grew more severe. But poverty is merciless, and obscurity no less so. The world around her glittered with new names, new stars, each adored as she once had been. She knew, better than any, that their brightness would also fade, that the cycle would repeat. Yet knowledge does not erase pain. To be forgotten is always sorrowful, especially for one who had once been so central. We might pause here and reflect on the indifference of systems. Hollywood did not intend cruelty toward Florence. It simply did not care. Its machinery moved forward, consuming novelty, discarding what was past. She, who had been essential, became unnecessary, and necessity is all the industry values. This indifference, more than malice, defines the tragedy of Florence's later life. She was not persecuted, she was ignored, and in some ways, to be ignored is the greater wound. In her quiet house, she surely carried with her the memories of what had been. The sound of audiences gasping at her first appearance, the thrill of hearing her name announced for the first time, the letters written by admirers who felt they knew her. These memories, though luminous, may have cut deeply, for they contrasted so sharply with her present. To live with memory is to live with both sweetness and sorrow. It sustains, yet it also reminds of loss. We might imagine her on an evening, seated at her small table, the light of a single lamp falling across her face. On the table lie a few coins, a letter left unanswered, a cup half empty. She stares into the lamp's glow, and in that glow perhaps she sees both herself and the distance between who she was and who she has become. Did she think herself a failure, or did she know herself as a pioneer? Did she despair, or did she endure with quiet acceptance? The answer is beyond us, hidden in her silence. The dust of her footsteps still stirs, faintly visible in a shaft of light, as if her presence, though overlooked, leaves traces that cannot be erased. She is diminished but not gone, forgotten but not entirely. For history, though slow to remember, will one day turn back to her. But in her own time, in her own final years, she lived as one abandoned, left to face the quiet alone. The dust hangs in the air, catching light before settling once more. And in its settling we sense another transformation, not into silence but into the faint scent of grease paint, the powder and paint of stages long past, the memory of her mother's world and her own beginnings. The dust becomes makeup, and the past rises with it, leading us backward to the inheritance she had carried all her life. The scent lingers, unresolved, calling us toward the next remembrance. The dust settles softly, and within it rises a faint scent, sharp and powdery, unmistakable to those who have known the stage. It is grease paint, the old companion of actors, clinging to fabric, to skin, to memory itself. This scent, drifting through Florence's later years, carried her backward into childhood, into the world of her mother, Charlotte, whose life upon the stage had been both livelihood and inheritance. For Florence, the smell of grease paint was not ornament, but atmosphere, present from her earliest days, woven into her very sense of self. Her mother, Charlotte Bridgewood, was a vaudeville actress in an age when performance meant constant travel, uncertain wages, and the tireless effort of captivating strangers night after night. She was no star of great renown, no legend inscribed in gilded letters, but she knew the craft of holding an audience, of shaping gestures into story. From her, Florence inherited not only a love of performance, but also the knowledge that performance was work, demanding, unstable, but necessary. Childhood for Florence meant watching her mother step into costumes, hearing her rehearse lines, witnessing the transformation of a woman into a character before the eyes of a crowd. This cycle of transformation seeped into Florence's bones. To perform was not a choice, but the very air she breathed. She understood, even as a girl, that faces could change under the stroke of powder, that movements could carry meaning beyond words, that illusion could hold a kind of truth. When she stepped into her first roles on stage, she was not entering a foreign world. She was continuing a lineage, walking a path already worn by her mother's footsteps. And yet, there is always a double edge to such inheritance. To be born into performance is to inherit not only its joys, but also its burdens. Charlotte's life had been one of restlessness, of constant adjustment, of precarious survival. The applause came, but so too did the exhaustion, the uncertainty of where the next engagement might be. Florence must have seen both, the thrill of being adored and the toll of being consumed. From her mother's example, she learned that the stage is both haven and trap, a place of beauty and of weariness. This paradox would mark Florence's life as deeply as it had marked Charlotte's. We might pause here to wonder what it means to inherit a destiny. Was Florence ever free to choose another path, or was she bound from the beginning to the world of performance? Perhaps she could have resisted, sought another trade, another calling. Yet the currents of life are powerful, and when one is born into a world of grease paint and applause, it is difficult to escape its pull. Florence was not forced by her mother. Rather, she was shaped by the atmosphere of her upbringing, drawn naturally to the stage and later to the screen. It is striking to consider how the smallest details of a childhood can echo through an entire life. The scent of grease paint, the hush before a curtain rises, the sound of hands clapping in rhythm. All these impressions remained with Florence, even when she no longer stood in the center of the stage. They were not memories only. They were part of her identity, inseparable from the woman she became. In her final years, when she sat in silence, these echoes must have returned to her with particular force, carrying her back to the warmth and difficulty of her beginnings. Her mother's influence reached further still. Charlotte, though an actress, was also inventive in spirit, securing patents for improvements in household devices. That same practical creativity lived in Florence, who would later conceive her own inventions for automobiles. It is as if performance and invention, illusion and practicality, were both woven into their lineage, passed from mother to daughter. Florence's life, though shaped by the demands of cinema, always carried this dual inheritance, the world of spectacle and the world of utility. The cycle of performance also shaped Florence's understanding of impermanence. A stage performance vanishes as soon as it is given. Applause fades, audiences disperse, and what remains is memory alone. This awareness, instilled early, may have prepared her for the fleeting nature of film fame. She knew, perhaps instinctively, that no applause endures, that no recognition is permanent. And yet, even knowing this, she sought it, as all performers must. For to perform is not to deny impermanence, but to embrace it, to offer oneself fully, even knowing it will vanish in the moment it is received. As Florence recalled these beginnings in her later years, she must have felt both gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for the gift of performance, for the craft and courage her mother had given her. Sorrow for the burdens that came with it, the instability, the restlessness, the endless hunger of audiences. Her life was, in many ways, a magnified version of her mother's, the same cycle, expanded by the machinery of cinema into something larger, harsher, more consuming. The stage had claimed Charlotte, and the screen had claimed Florence. Both gave themselves, and both were left, in the end, with silence. The scent of grease paint lingers, faint but persistent, like a thread tying past to present. It is a reminder that Florence's story is not hers alone, but part of a larger pattern, a cycle repeated through generations of performers, each rising, each fading, each giving themselves to the gaze of strangers. This cycle did not begin with her, nor did it end with her. Yet within it, she stood as the first to be named, the first to embody the new world of cinematic fame. She carried her inheritance into uncharted territory, and in doing so, she transformed not only her life, but the very culture of the century. The scent grows sharper now, as though someone has just applied it fresh to the skin. A face looms in shadow, powder smoothed across cheeks, paint darkening eyes, lips brighten to be seen from afar. But this is no stage actress preparing for an audience. It is Florence herself, recalling the fire that once scarred her body, the pain that followed, the cost of beauty demanded by the screen. The scent of grease paint merges with the smell of burned flesh, unresolved, pulling us into the shadows of injury and suffering that marked her later life. The scent of grease paint sharpens, but it does not linger sweetly. It merges with another smell, acrid and harsh, the scent of burning wood and scorched cloth. It is the memory of fire, sudden and merciless, leaping across a film set and leaving Florence Lawrence scarred. What had once been the adornment of performance, powder, paint, costume, was stripped away in an instant, replaced by raw flesh, searing pain, and the cruel reminder that illusion always rests upon the frail surface of the body. In those early years of cinema, safety was a luxury seldom considered. Studios were improvised, equipment crude, sets often flammable. Lights blazed hot, chemicals ignited easily, and actors worked amid hazards that seemed invisible until disaster struck. For Florence, who gave herself wholly to her craft, the price was not theoretical. It was written into her skin. One day during a production, fire caught, spreading with frightening speed. She was burned, her face and body marked. Though she recovered enough to return to work, the scars remained, a constant reminder of the cost exacted by her devotion to the screen. Pain followed her after that, pain both visible and invisible. The healing was imperfect, the nerves never fully quiet. Doctors could treat but not cure, prescribe but not erase. The woman once adored for her radiance now bore the knowledge that beauty is fragile, subject to the whims of accident. In an industry that prized appearances above all, the scars must have weighed upon her, not only physically but emotionally. Did she fear that audiences would see them, that the illusion of perfection would fracture? Or did she conceal them, carrying the aches silently, as she carried so many of her burdens? Illness, too, shadowed her in the years that followed. Ailments of the stomach, pains in the joints, exhaustion that clung to her body. She suffered quietly, enduring with the same persistence that had carried her through every other trial. Yet each new illness seemed to chip away at her strength, leaving her more vulnerable, more fragile. The energy that had once allowed her to work tirelessly diminished, and the weight of ordinary tasks grew heavier. Here we see another dimension of her tragedy. The star whose face had been sold as image, whose body had been treated as commodity, now found that same body betraying her, declining under strain. The industry that had used her vitality offered no shelter when vitality waned. She was left to endure in private, her suffering hidden, her decline unremarked. For the public, stars exist only in their brightness. Few wish to see their dimming. Yet within this suffering, there was also resilience. Florence did not retreat entirely into despair. She continued to seek roles, continued to work in small ways, continued to appear. She did not allow injury or illness to erase her entirely. Even when pain was constant, she endured, she persisted, she remained. There is dignity in such endurance, though it is seldom honored. We admire triumph more than survival, yet survival in the face of relentless hardship may be the greater triumph. We may pause and reflect on the body as both vessel and burden. For performers, the body is instrument, medium, even currency. It is adorned, displayed, consumed. Yet it is also fragile, subject to accident, to decay, to suffering. Florence knew this deeply, perhaps more than most. Her body had lifted her to fame, had carried her into adoration, and her body also bore the scars of that journey, the pain that followed, the illness that would not relent. She who embodied the glamour of early cinema also embodied its hidden costs. Did she see her scars as shame or as reminder of what she had given? Did she view her illnesses as misfortune or as part of the natural toll of a life lived so fully? Again, we cannot know, for Florence spoke little of these matters. Her silence leaves us to wonder. Yet in that wondering lies recognition. Her body was not an image only, but a reality, marked and weary. And in that reality, she becomes not symbol but human, closer to us than the films would ever suggest. Her suffering was not without loneliness. Illness isolates, for pain is difficult to share, difficult to explain. Friends may visit, but they cannot carry the ache within one's own skin. Florence endured much of it alone, her house quiet, her nights long. She'd been seen by millions, but in her suffering she was unseen, as so many are. The applause that once surrounded her could not ease the silence of pain. And yet, even in her decline, there may have been moments of light, a neighbor's kindness, a flower blooming unexpectedly in her garden, a day when pain lifted enough to allow her a walk in the sun. Such moments, though small, are not insignificant. They are the mercies by which endurance is made possible. Perhaps Florence clung to them, finding in their simplicity a reminder that life, though diminished, still held beauty. The scent of grease paint, mingled with the memory of fire, drifts now into another image, a scar traced by shadow, delicate yet undeniable, etched across skin that once seemed untouchable. The scar is not only mark but metaphor, symbol of the cost of beauty, of the price of performance. It lingers in the dim light, a reminder that behind every illusion lies a body, vulnerable and finite. The shadow lengthens across the scar, and in its lengthening another shape emerges. It stretches upward across the hills, where great white letters stand against the sky, spelling a name larger than any star, larger even than Florence's once had been. The Hollywood sign towers above, gleaming in the sun, a monument to the industry that consumed her. The scar fades into the shadow of those letters, unresolved, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The scar dissolves into shadow, and the shadow lengthens upward until it merges with great white letters upon a hillside. Hollywood. They stand stark against the California sky, gleaming in the sunlight by day, glowing under lamps by night, a monument to a dream that has grown far larger than any one life. When Florence Lawrence looks toward those letters, she sees not merely a sign, but a world that has expanded beyond her, a world she helped to begin, but which no longer has need of her presence. The sign was first erected in the early 1920s, not as a monument to cinema, but as an advertisement for real estate. Yet quickly it became symbol, shorthand for an industry that now defined the imagination of the world. To millions across oceans and continents, the name Hollywood meant glamour, fortune, dream. To Florence, it must have meant something more complicated, a reminder that she had once been its first face, that her own story was woven into its foundation, yet also that she now lived in its shadow, unseen. Those towering letters, bold and indifferent, did not bend toward her. They proclaimed a world that moved ever forward, producing new stars, new spectacles, new illusions. They honored no one name, no one pioneer. They represented the system itself, vast and impersonal, a machine of dreams that consumed and discarded with equal force. Florence could walk beneath them, could see them from her modest home, but they did not see her. They loomed like silent witnesses, monuments to an age that had already left her behind. And yet, perhaps she felt a strange kinship with them. They were letters, mere shapes of wood and paint, yet they carried immense symbolic power, just as her own face once had. They stood as facade, as image, projecting grandeur to the world while concealing the frailty of their structure, subject to decay, in need of repair. Florence, too, had been image and facade, radiant on screen while her body bore scars and her heart bore solitude. The sign and the star shared this duality, surface brilliance, hidden fragility. We might pause here and reflect on monuments. They appear eternal, commanding, yet they are as mortal as the hands that built them. The Hollywood sign, like Florence, was destined to fade, to crumble, to require renewal. What endures is not the material, but the symbol, the story that clings to it. Florence herself, though forgotten in her time, would one day be remembered as symbol, the first star, the pioneer. The letters upon the hill and the name of Florence Lawrence both remind us that symbols outlast bodies, though bodies pay the price of their creation. In the 1930s, as Florence's health declined and her finances dwindled, the sign rose higher in cultural imagination. She could no longer command headlines, but the sign did. She could no longer draw audiences, but the name Hollywood itself drew millions. To live beneath it must have been both pride and torment. Pride in knowing she had been there at the beginning, torment in knowing she was no longer included in its story. The sign loomed, indifferent, as her days grew quieter, her life more fragile. Did she walk the hills and look up at the letters? Did she pause and wonder if anyone remembered that before the sign, before the industry, before the glamour, there had been a single young woman whose name had first broken the silence of anonymity? Or did she avert her eyes, unwilling to measure her smallness against its immensity? We cannot know. Yet the image is powerful. Florence standing in shadow, gazing upward, her own story eclipsed by the monument of the system she helped to create. The sign proclaimed permanence, but Florence knew the truth of impermanence more than most. She had lived it, the rise, the glory, the decline. She understood that nothing in Hollywood endured unchanged, not faces, not names, not even monuments. Perhaps in this knowledge she found a kind of calm, a recognition that her own fading was not personal, but part of the larger rhythm of all things. To be forgotten was not hers alone. It was the fate of all who had stood in light. And yet acceptance does not erase sorrow. The letters glowed in the night, visible for miles, while she, within her small house, lit only a modest lamp. The contrast must have been sharp, a reminder of distance between past and present, between symbol and self. She had been Hollywood's first face, but now Hollywood's face was an abstraction, vast and impersonal, leaving no room for the pioneer who had begun it. The sign casts its shadow across the hills, stretching long as the sun declines. In that shadow, Florence moves quietly, her figure small against the vastness of the city's dream. She is both part of it and excluded from it, bound to its history yet absent from its present. The letters stand tall, indifferent, as she slips further into obscurity. The shadow deepens, lengthening until it becomes darkness. And within that darkness, another sound begins, the harsh caw of a crow circling above, black wings cutting the air, voice raw and insistent. The crow circles in the shadow of the sign, unresolved, its cry carrying us forward into the deeper despair of Florence's final years. The crow circles slowly above the hills, its wings beating against the air with a sound both heavy and hollow. Each caw falls sharp against the silence, a reminder that endings draw near. Below, the Hollywood sign gleams impassive, a monument to beginnings, while Florence Lawrence walks beneath it, nearing her final chapter. The year is 1938, and her days have grown narrow, bound by illness, by poverty, and by solitude. Once she had been surrounded by the roar of crowds, her name newly spoken on every lip. Now her companions are shadows, her audience the walls of her modest home. Her health, long fragile, had worsened. Chronic pain gnawed at her body, the lingering effects of burns, the slow decay of illness, the exhaustion that no rest seemed to relieve. Each movement carried effort, each day required endurance. The woman once known for her vitality and expressive grace now struggled to climb steps, to lift objects, to find comfort in her own skin. Doctors had names for her ailments, but little in the way of remedies. Pills and potions promised relief, but the relief never lasted, and the pain always returned. Her finances offered no safety. The money, once abundant, had been consumed by poor investments, by bad luck, by the sheer indifference of an industry that offered nothing to its pioneers. Florence had given Hollywood its first star, but Hollywood gave her no pension, no acknowledgement, no care. She lived frugally, counting coins, worrying over expenses, dependent sometimes on small kindnesses from others, but never secure. The anxiety of poverty pressed upon her as heavily as pain, a weight not of the body but of the spirit. Loneliness deepened these burdens. Marriages had failed, friendships had drifted away, and the bustling industry around her had no place for her anymore. She was known to only a few, remembered dimly by some who had once adored her, but in her daily life she was unseen. To walk unnoticed through streets where once her name had filled marquees is a sorrow few can fully imagine. The invisibility she endured in her last years was more absolute than the anonymity of her first. At least then, as the Biograph Girl, she was adored without a name. Now she had a name, yet scarcely anyone spoke it. In her solitude, memories must have gathered thickly. She may have recalled the first thrill of hearing her name announced in a theater, the letters printed in bold type, the excitement of knowing she had changed the very fabric of cinema. She may have remembered the crowds, the applause, the endless letters from admirers. And alongside those luminous memories came the darker ones, the fire that scarred her, the marriages that left her wounded, the silence of a home too empty. Memory, for Florence, was both balm and torment, sustaining her yet also reminding her of what had been lost. Despair is rarely sudden. It gathers slowly like a fog seeping into every corner until the world itself seems dimmed. For Florence, despair must have been such a fog, thick, persistent, numbing, pain without relief, poverty without reprieve, solitude without end. To wake each day to the same burdens, with no prospect of change, is to feel life narrowing to a point too sharp to endure. In such a fog, even the brightest memories lose their power to comfort. And so, in December of 1938, Florence made her final decision. She mixed poison, prepared carefully, and lay down in her modest Hollywood bungalow. The woman who had once been the first to be called by name on the silver screen now chose silence, final and irrevocable. It was not an act of drama, but of exhaustion, the surrender of one who had carried too much for too long. She was 52 years old. We may pause here and ask, was her death inevitable, the natural consequence of her decline, or could another path have been possible had the world remembered her more kindly? Had the industry she created cared for her as she had cared for it? Such questions have no answer, yet they rise naturally, for her death feels less like fate and more like neglect. Florence did not die only of illness or despair. She died of being forgotten. The crow still circles above, its dark wings blotting out pieces of the sky. Its cry echoes as if calling to her, as if marking the passing of a soul that once shone so brightly. Below, the silence of her bungalow deepens. Neighbors notice the stillness, the faint hiss of gas, the absence of movement. Days later, her body is discovered. News spreads faintly, without urgency, noted in brief columns, received with a quiet surprise. The first movie star has died, and few had noticed she was still alive. There's a particular cruelty in such obscurity. To be remembered only in death is to be denied the comfort of recognition in life. And yet perhaps there is also a strange grace. Her name returned to print, her story whispered again, her significance recalled. Too late for her, yet not too late for memory itself. The pioneer was gone, but the record of her pioneering remained. The crow dips lower now, its shadow passing across the silent house. The hiss of gas has ceased, the room lies still. Yet beyond that stillness there is movement. The rustle of leaves in a nearby yard stirred by wind. The leaves lift, scatter, and drift down again, unresolved, as if carrying with them the faint memory of applause, long vanished. The leaves rustle in the wind, lifting for a moment into the air before settling back upon the ground. Each one turns slowly as it falls, quiet and unnoticed, like a soul departing without ceremony. So too did Florence Lawrence leave the world, softly, without the thunder of applause, without the grandeur of monuments. When her body was discovered in that small Hollywood bungalow in December of 1938, the news carried little weight. The papers noted her passing in brief lines. Some recalled faintly that she had once been called the first movie star, but few lingered upon the memory. The silence that had filled her final days spilled outward, enfolding even her death. Her funeral was modest, attended by only a handful. There were no crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, no long queues of mourners. The cameras that had once whirred endlessly for her did not gather. Those who came did so quietly, offering respect not only to a woman but to the memory of an era now gone. For Florence represented not only herself, but the dawn of cinema, the fragile moment when light first touched faces on a screen and gave them to the public. To stand by her grave was to stand also with the ghost of that beginning, when films were short and silent, when audiences leaned forward with wonder at shadows brought to life. The scene at her burial was far from the grandeur she once embodied. A modest casket, a brief ceremony, words spoken with sincerity but without spectacle. There were no headlines proclaiming the loss, no public outpouring. It was as if she slipped into the earth as quietly as she had lived in her final years. And yet, for those who did remember, her passing carried a weight that silence could not erase. They knew that in this modest funeral lay the end of a life that had once transformed the world. We may pause here and reflect on the strange fate of pioneers. They shape the future, they open paths, they alter culture itself, yet often they are not honored until long after they are gone. Florence's funeral was not the recognition she deserved, but it was, in a sense, fitting. The first star, who had lived between anonymity and erasure, departed without the ceremony given to those who came after her. Her life had been defined by being both visible and invisible, and in death she remained so. Imagine the cemetery that day. The winter sun pale above, the air cool, the sound of birds faint in the distance. The handful of mourners stand quietly, their breaths rising in the air, their words low and solemn. The earth is turned, the casket lowered, the soil falling softly in muted thuds. Around them stretch other graves, other names, some forgotten, some remembered. Florence joins them, her name inscribed upon stone, but her story already drifting beyond the memory of those gathered. And yet, memory is a strange thing. Though she was not celebrated at her death, her story did not vanish. In time, historians, writers, and lovers of film would turn back to her, would rediscover her face, her name, her role as the first. The world that had ignored her in life would later seek her in archives, in old reels, in yellowed papers. Recognition, though belated, would come. But in 1938, none of that was certain. The funeral was small, the silence deep, and her journey seemed complete. We might wonder what those few who stood by her grave thought. Did they recall her youth, her beauty, the way she moved across a screen with such natural grace? Did they think of her inventions, her foresight, her resilience? Or did they feel only sorrow, the sadness of seeing one who had given so much laid to rest with so little acknowledgement? Perhaps they thought all these things at once, their minds as full of contradictions as her life had been. Her burial was not the end of her presence, however. In film reels stored in archives, in advertisements tucked into boxes, in fading posters, her image endured. The pioneer was gone, but the light she had first embodied still flickered faintly, waiting for the curious to seek it out. In this sense, Florence's funeral was both an ending and a pause, a silence awaiting rediscovery. The leaves that fell upon her grave that day continued to drift, carried by the wind, settling softly until the earth was covered. Each leaf a reminder that lives, like seasons, end in quiet descent. Yet beneath the soil lies continuity, for new growth comes again in spring. Florence, though forgotten in the moment, would one day be remembered anew, her story told again, her place honored. The wind that carried those leaves does not cease. It moves outward, brushing across the cemetery, across the city, across the hills. It stirs the branches of nearby trees, and their shadows fall across the gravestones. In that shifting shadow, another image emerges. Reels of celluloid, dusty and fragile, stored away in forgotten vaults. The funeral fades into the whir of a projector, its light flickering once more, unresolved, waiting to recall her face in moving shadows. The reels sit in their metal canisters, dusty and brittle, forgotten on the shelves of archives and storerooms. Time has dimmed their labels, and dust clings to their edges. Yet within them, Florence Lawrence still lives. Her movements, captured more than a century ago, remain etched upon celluloid. Though her body has returned to earth, her image endures in the flicker of light through fragile film. It is here, in these reels, that she is resurrected, not as flesh and blood, but as shadow and gesture, a presence more delicate yet also more enduring. When the reels are placed upon a projector, the whir begins. The light arcs across the darkness, and there she is once again. A face turns, eyes wide with emotion, lips trembling in silent expression. The gestures are broad, as they had to be in those early days, but behind them lies something unmistakable: sincerity. Florence moves with a natural grace that speaks even now, beyond the silence of her films, beyond the gulf of years. She reminds us that humanity does not vanish. It lingers in light. Audiences of today watching these old fragments may see only quaint relics, silent dramas of another age. But to those who look closely, there is something else: the birth of a language, the discovery of how movement and expression could tell stories without words. Florence was among the first to shape that language, to prove that film could carry more than spectacle, that it could hold character, emotion, presence. In her eyes and gestures lay the seed of modern performance. Every star who came after her, knowingly or not, walked in her footsteps. There is a paradox here. In life, Florence was forgotten, her final years marked by obscurity. But in film, she remains, her youth preserved, her face glowing as it once did, her movements unaltered by time. Death silenced her voice, yet the reels speak still, their flicker restoring what memory alone cannot hold. She was the first to be named, and though that name was neglected for decades, the films themselves never ceased to carry it, quietly, in the archives of history. We may pause here to reflect on the nature of film itself. Unlike the stage, where performance vanishes with the final curtain, film preserves. It holds time captive, allows faces and gestures to remain long after the bodies that made them are gone. Florence, who lived with the knowledge of impermanence, also lived at the dawn of permanence, though she may not have fully realized it. She gave herself to film, and film gave her back to us, even when the world forgot. In this lies a strange form of justice. She was neglected in life, but she could not be erased. As the reels turn, as her face reappears upon the screen, we feel both wonder and sorrow. Wonder at seeing her again, alive in light. Sorrow at knowing the contrast between the luminous figure on screen and the solitary woman who died unseen. The films reveal her beauty, her talent, her vitality, yet they also remind us of the cruelty of forgetting, of the gulf between fame and remembrance. To watch her is to feel both joy and grief intertwined. Historians and archivists, in time, rediscovered her story. They looked back to those reels, to the advertisements, to the brief newspaper notices, and they pieced together her life. The forgotten star became remembered again, not in crowds, but in words, in writings, in retrospectives. Her name, once absent from headlines, began to return. The first star, the pioneer, the Biograph Girl, she was restored to her place in history, belatedly honored as the one who began the age of celebrity. What she did not receive in life, she began to receive in memory. And so Florence Lawrence lives again, not only in celluloid but in stories. Each time her name is spoken, each time her films are shown, she is resurrected. Her obscurity is not complete, her silence not final. Memory becomes a form of life, fragile but enduring, and in this way her tragedy is softened. She is still with us, though her house has fallen, though her grave lies quiet. The reels spin, and the first star shines again. The projector whirs, its sound filling the room with steady rhythm. The light flickers, illuminating her face against the screen. For a moment, it seems as though time itself has bent, as though she has returned, as though we sit once again among the audiences of the early 20th century, leaning forward to see the woman whose name was first spoken. But the reels are fragile, the celluloid brittle, the light flickers uncertainly. The image trembles, then fades, leaving the screen blank. The whir slows, the reel ends, the room falls silent. The silence is not empty, however. It hums with the echo of what we have seen, with the knowledge that though the reel has stopped, memory has been stirred. And in that silence, another sound begins, faint and unresolved. The turning of pages in a book, the scratch of a pen across paper. Writers and historians lean forward, seeking her story, inscribing her name once more, ensuring that the woman who died in silence will not remain silent forever. The pen scratches softly across the page, leaving trails of ink that turn silence into record. Beside it, the pages rustle as they are turned, gathering fragments of the past, piecing together a story almost lost. Writers and historians lean over their desks. Archivists unseal reels of film, and students of cinema pause before faint photographs. They are searching for the one who stood at the beginning. And slowly, carefully, they restore her name, Florence Lawrence. For decades after her passing, she'd been little more than a footnote, her final years overshadowed by neglect, her death scarcely noted. But memory, like a tide, sometimes returns. As film itself grew older, as scholars began to study its origins, the figure of the first movie star emerged again. They asked, who was the Biograph Girl? Who was the first to be named, the first to transform actors from shadows into celebrities? And the answer, long hidden, came softly back. It was Florence. Books were written, essays published, documentaries filmed. Her image, once flickering only in silent reels, was now projected in lecture halls, reprinted in histories, recalled in discussions of cinema's dawn. She became, once more, not only a figure of tragedy, but of significance, the pioneer who had opened the gates of fame. What the industry had failed to give her in life, history began to offer in remembrance. Her story, fragile but enduring, returned to light. There is a peculiar justice in such belated recognition. It does not erase the loneliness of her final years, nor the poverty, nor the despair. Those sorrows remain etched into her life, but it does ensure that her name, once nearly lost, now endures. To be remembered is not everything, but it is something. And for Florence, whose life was shaped by the tension between being seen and being forgotten, remembrance carries a weight deeper than applause. As these histories emerged, audiences began to see her not only as symbol but as person. They read of her childhood in Canada, her mother's vaudeville career, her rise with Biograph, her invention of automobile signals, her suffering, her final act. They saw in her story both the triumph of being first and the tragedy of being discarded. And in this duality, they recognized something profoundly human. Florence was no longer only the first movie star. She was a woman, complex, gifted, wounded, resilient, and fragile. Her grave, once plain and little visited, began to draw the footsteps of those who wished to honor her. Flowers were left, words spoken, gestures of recognition offered. For many, to stand at her resting place was to acknowledge the debt owed to her, to say silently what history had once refused, "We remember." Her grave became not a place of silence, but of belated gratitude, where the forgotten pioneer was finally named again. We may pause here to reflect on the nature of legacy. Legacy is not only what one achieves in life, but what is remembered after. Florence's life was marked by contradiction, adored yet abandoned, celebrated yet forgotten. But her legacy, though delayed, became clearer with time. She is remembered now as the first, the one who proved that a name could matter, that an actor could be more than a shadow. Her legacy is not only in what she achieved, but in the very structure of celebrity itself, a structure that has shaped culture ever since. Her story also became caution, a reminder of the cruelty of fame. Scholars and filmmakers spoke of her not only to honor her, but to warn. The system that exalts can also discard. The applause that fills the air can vanish into silence. In Florence's life, both truths are visible. She stands as both triumph and tragedy, inspiration and warning. And in this duality, her story retains its power. Later generations of film lovers, watching her early reels, often speak of the poignancy of her face. There is something in her eyes that seems to know the weight of the future, something that feels both luminous and vulnerable. Whether this is truth or projection, we cannot say. Perhaps it is only that we now see her through the lens of her later fate. But the effect is real. To watch Florence is to feel the fragility of all fame, the fleeting nature of light. The pen scratches on, the pages turn, and Florence Lawrence is written back into history. She is no longer the silent shadow of the Biograph Girl, but the first star, the pioneer, the woman who carried both glory and sorrow. Memory has returned her, not as she might have wished, but as she deserves. Her life, once nearly erased, is now inscribed in the books of cinema. The pages close, the pen rests, the archivist switches off the lamp, and in the silence that follows, another sound emerges faintly, the rustle of fabric, as though a curtain stirs before a stage. The curtain, heavy and dark, trembles slightly in unseen air, unresolved, waiting to be drawn aside. The curtain trembles as though stirred by a hidden draft, heavy folds shifting in the quiet. For a moment it seems poised to rise, as if another performance were about to begin, though the stage beyond lies empty. This is the fitting image for Florence Lawrence's story, a curtain forever moving between presence and absence, between recognition and forgetting, between applause and silence. She was the first to step into the light of cinema as more than a shadow, the first to have her name spoken, the first to embody the figure of the movie star. And yet she was also the first to vanish into obscurity, the first to pay the price of a system that exalts and abandons. Her life, balanced between triumph and tragedy, remains unresolved, like the curtain itself. We recall her beginnings, born into the world of performance through her mother, Charlotte, who carried the scent of grease paint and the fatigue of the stage. We recall her rise when she stood at Biograph, her image moving silently upon the screen, captivating audiences who did not yet know her name. We recall the transformation when she became the first to be named publicly, breaking the barrier of anonymity, ushering in the age of celebrity. For a moment she embodied all that was new and dazzling, adored as no film actress had ever been before. And yet we also recall the shadows that followed, the fires that scarred her, the illnesses that weakened her, the failed marriages, the poor investments, the slow erosion of fortune. We recall her solitude, her final years spent in pain and obscurity, her despair culminating in that silent act of departure in 1938. We recall the quiet funeral, the modest grave, the way her death passed almost unnoticed by the world that once adored her. These shadows weigh heavily, yet they are inseparable from her light. To tell her story is to hold both side by side without resolution. Her legacy, belatedly restored, now carries her name forward. Film historians, archivists, writers, and lovers of cinema speak of her as pioneer, as symbol of both the promise and the peril of fame. She is remembered as the one who proved that an actor's presence could command audiences, that a name could be currency, that a face could be more than anonymous shadow. She is also remembered as the one forgotten, the one whose end warns of the cruelty of a system that depends on novelty. In Florence Lawrence, the paradox of stardom is made visible. To shine brightly is also to risk being extinguished quickly. We may pause here and ask, what does it mean to be first? To be first is to open the path but not to walk it fully. Others follow, reaping more of its rewards, receiving more of its honors. Florence was first, and in that lies both her glory and her tragedy. She proved the possibility of stardom, yet she did not live to enjoy its protections, for those protections did not yet exist. Her fame was experimental, and experiments are often discarded even when they succeed. She was the pioneer, and pioneers are remembered more for what they opened than for what they kept. And yet, in being first, Florence holds a place no one can take. Others surpassed her in fame, in fortune, in endurance, but none could erase her priority. She remains the first movie star, the first to be named, the first to show the world what a screen performer could be. That cannot be undone. However belatedly, however imperfectly, history must return to her, for she was the origin. Her story lingers precisely because it carries both triumph and sorrow, both brilliance and forgetting. The curtain stirs again, as if to remind us that performance never fully ends. Though Florence is gone, her image remains upon film, her name inscribed in histories, her story whispered in the quiet of nights like this one. Each time her name is spoken, each time her face flickers upon a screen, she rises once more, not as she was in her final years, but as she was in her youth, luminous, expressive, filled with promise. Film preserves what life cannot, and in its light she endures. We may also reflect on ourselves, on the nature of memory and fame. What do we seek in remembering Florence Lawrence? Perhaps we seek not only her story, but also our own reflection, the reminder that all recognition is fleeting, that all applause fades, that behind every face of glamour lies a human being marked by fragility. Her life teaches not only about cinema's beginning, but about the universality of longing, of endurance, of being seen and then forgotten. In remembering her, we acknowledge both the beauty and the sorrow of all human striving. The curtain trembles once more, then stills. Beyond it lies no performance, no stage, no applause. Yet in the stillness there is presence, the quiet knowledge that her story remains. Florence Lawrence, the first star, is gone, but not lost. She lingers in film, in books, in the whisper of her name. Her life cannot be reduced to triumph alone, nor to tragedy alone. It was both, interwoven, unresolved. The curtain remains, heavy and silent, waiting. And as we gaze upon it, we hear a sound, faint and almost imperceptible, the turning of a reel somewhere in the distance, the flicker of light just beginning to glow upon a screen. The image does not yet appear. The reel has not yet revealed its face. It hums softly, unresolved, inviting us to remember, to imagine, to let Florence's story drift with us into silence, into thought, into dreams.